in terms of recruitment, it's been problematic since, I'd say, December 23, when General Zaluzhny said, allegedly, that they need 500,000 men, so the armed forces. And President Zelensky tried to push the blame on Zaluzhny, saying, well, now we need to recruit those 500,000. And we have seen that the mobilization law has been in and out of Rada with modifications, and still nobody's willing, or at least Zelensky is not willing to sign it as is, because it might lead to polarization of the society, specifically because of points like those who have an income above a certain level would be exempt, because somebody has to finance the economy, because you have to pay those people. You cannot just send them to the front without kit, without food, without anything. So you have to pay them salaries. And so that is a huge problem, and a problem that Syrskyi has been kind of trying to ameliorate by saying, well, we could do with 200,000. And now there is this issue that you are recruiting people, and there are a lot of videos of people fighting the recruiters, the military recruiters, and there is all sorts of violence going on. So on the one hand, you have that societal problem, because it seems like the society doesn't have that same amount of will it had back in March 2022. So that is one problem. The other problem is the people who might be sent to the front lines are not trained enough. They are not motivated, and could demotivate and affect the will of the units who are fighting. And yet another problem, which has something to do with this mobilization law, is the fact that the rear of the Ukrainian armed forces is rather fat, in quotation marks. And those who are fighting on the battlefield, they need rotation, and Ukraine is losing people. So one of the ways, and what Syrskyi could do, is kind of reshuffle the balance there. But again, this could lead to problems internally within the armed forces. So I think it's a very serious situation, which is often understated in Western media specifically, saying, well, as soon as we give Ukraine artillery shells and air defense and drones, they will be fine, and maybe F-16s too. But the real problem is that they don't have any capable or little capable manpower left in order to operate those technologies. What the Russians are doing, they're pushing across different directions, shall we say. So we see Avdiivka, for instance, we see Toninke, we see Pervomayske. That's where the Russian forces are pushing, and supposedly the Ukrainian troops were supposed to fall back on defensive lines. But the problem is those defensive lines have not been prepared. And so the Russians, seeing that, they keep on pushing them out. And you cannot concentrate. So if you have that shortage of manpower, and you have the Russians pushing also in Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is right now not as important, but we have seen advances in Robotyne by the Russian forces. But I think the one of the most critical points is Chasiv Yar right now, which is south of Bakhmut, or Artemovsk, as the Russians call it. And the reason for that is that it's a logistical hub. It's been one since 2014, and during the battle for Bakhmut, when the Wagner Group was there, the Ukrainians used Chasiv Yar in order to rotate troop formations in and out of Bakhmut. And so it's a key point for the Russians to take, because, as I have been arguing many times, the Russians will essentially want to go towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And in order to enable that offensive, they would have to control Chasiv Yar and push the Ukrainian forces to the west and take over control of that logistical node, which will then facilitate the Russian operation. Because why am I stressing this? Logistics are key to conducting military operations. And so the Russians have learned it the hard way. We remember the 3-day offensive, or the supposed 3-day offensive, when the Russians were kind of trying to take Kiev, which I don't think was the real intent. It was more as a show of force. But they had all their logistical lines exposed. They could not sustain the troops. There were not enough troops to hold Kiev to start with, but even if, they would have had difficulties to sustain them, and they realized it very quickly. The second adjustment came when the Ukrainians started using HIMARS, and the Russians had then to disperse their logistics in order to protect them. And now we're seeing that they want to go west. But the problem is, how do you supply the troops? How do you ensure that the Ukrainians don't cut off your logistics? And if that happens, then the troops are cut off. And then the Ukrainians could easily surround them and defeat them in detail. So I think that for the Ukrainian side, and that's what General Syrsky has been doing, he was sending reinforcements specifically to Chasiv Yar, understanding the importance of this. There are kind of this seemingly unimportant towns, villages, if you wish, that pop up, and suddenly everybody's talking about them. And the reason for that is specifically because they are located next to a rail station, or they're located next to highway nodes and things like that, which need to be controlled. And so from that perspective, I don't know if General Syrsky will be able to stop the Russians in their tracks in Chasiv Yar. I think it's I personally think that it might fall given the situation that we're seeing, and the Ukrainian forces, the rest of the forces being tied down around Avdiivka, Kupiansk, Seversk, Zaporizhia, so all those, and also we have Kherson, we have Krimki as well, which is, I don't know what's going to happen to that bridgehead. So they cannot concentrate and defend just one specific point. And if they did, then the Russians would make progress in other directions. So you don't really have a good play here.
The United States and work with whoever is elected for the benefit of both our countries.
It's difficult to say what Donald Trump will do if he becomes president, but certainly for him, he is a nationalist globalist, so America first. And I think if he can negotiate some deal from which America will benefit, even if it be with Putin, then he will do that. And he did actually, the one side of potential implications of his presidency would be NATO. What happens to NATO? Are the Americans going to drop NATO altogether? And the second one, how is he going to go about the Ukrainian crisis? And I mean, the United States is still importing uranium from Russia for its nuclear power plants. So there is still trade going on. And we have seen that in many ways, sanctions imposed on Russia have not benefited the European economies either. So they didn't have the desired effect on Russia, but they did quite a lot of damage to European economies. And so that calls into question whether Trump will allow for these sanctions to continue, because that might hurt the US economic interests. So I can only project, it doesn't mean that there will be no competition with Russia and that he will be best friends with Putin. No, certainly he will compete with Russia, but in a different, on a different chessboard, and that will be more of an economic chessboard rather than the military chessboard. And so from this perspective, it could be, knowing that Ukraine is fully dependent on external help, that he could say, well, we will make a deal here. The rest of Ukraine, whatever Russia controls now, remains under Russian control, and perhaps offer something to Ukraine, like the EU membership, for instance. Because in order to join NATO or EU, you need to have clearly defined borders, which Ukraine doesn't have at this point. So resolving that issue, and not just ceasefire, but clearly defined legal borders recognized internationally, because there are actually criteria for recognizing statehood of a territory, the Montevideo criteria of 1934. And so international recognition of Ukraine as is, demarcation of those borders, could be a way to resolve this. And of course, the Ukrainian side will not like this. But who is sitting on the lever was military aid. Either you do as we say, or you won't get any aid, then I'll let the Russians take as much as they want, or I could make it stop now, would be maybe or possibly the Trump line here.